Hi and welcome to this episode of In Talks With. I'm Danielle Radoichin. I'm very lucky to have as a guest on this episode the wonderful American artist Laurie Simmons, who I spoke to via Zoom. Although we've never met in real life, I actually have recorded with Laurie before for the Matches Fashion podcast, really great monthly series I host called In Conversation, in which Laurie was speaking to the fashion designer Gabriella Hurst, and we recorded it last year. And if you like this series, you should definitely check out that one. We feature some really great guests. Anyway, as fate would have it, after that conversation, I bumped into Laurie again, digitally, when my sister was the manicurist at the wedding of Laurie's daughter, Lena Dunham, last year. And Laurie sent me a hilarious message via my sister's WhatsApp. Anyway, we agreed that we still had lots of stuff to discuss. And then finally last month, I visited an exhibition of Laurie's work at the Amanda Wilkinson Gallery in Soho here in London. Amanda's Laurie's gallerist. And the exhibition also featured works by the late photographer Jimmy DeSana, Laurie's great friend and mentor throughout the 70s and 80s. Anyway, as Laurie and I share an interest in the intersection of art and fashion, I was so delighted when she agreed to join me on the podcast to tell me about Jimmy and an exciting new project she's working on of his work. And we also talked about the meaning of photography in the digital age, her love of the artificial, and why her work feels fresher than ever today. We didn't really get to talk about much fashion in the end, but maybe that's for next time. Anyway, hope you enjoy. And where are you?
I'm in one of my studios in Connecticut. This is a studio that's kind of like my laboratory. I have a big shooting studio, but those are all sorts of things I've shot over the years, like all my originals and negatives. And so this is a really cool room that you can see there's a beautiful view. So I'm in Connecticut. This is where I really work and hang out. And I'm going to New York tomorrow, but this is where work happens.
I saw your show at Amanda Wilkinson last week. The pieces I had never, it was amazing. It was interesting seeing your pieces, and Jimmy's so large, because I'd seen them in book size or catalogs.
Yes, right. That was your first human scale viewing, kind of.
Yeah. No, it was very cool. And had you had a lot to do with? Did you choose them?
No, she did the whole thing. I mean, I sort of am. I trust Amanda. So Amanda just comes up with an idea and then she says, will you let me do this? And there's no micromanaging. I just like whatever Amanda wants to do. She always runs it by me, like, look at the wall color. And we thought, that's great. And look at the selection. That's great.
She mentioned the wall color to me because I said it looks like blackberry yogurt flavor color.
I couldn't. To me, online, it looked like coffee yogurt. But anyway.
Right. No, it was great.
But she has fantastic taste in both, in her personal style and her art. I mean, she's just great.
Great gallerist, yeah. But do you want to talk a bit about Jimmy and your relationship with him? Because I think, do you look after his estate?
Yeah, I'm the executor.
What you and he were doing it feels so fresh and modern, like it could have been shot yesterday.
That's what I always say. I'm so happy you're saying that.
And so many of the themes resonate with what's happening today, especially with regards to the internet and social media and how we present ourselves online. So I suppose I wanted to go in somehow at that angle, but I think it would be really useful to hear a bit of context, maybe about how you guys work, how you met and started to work together, for people who don't know.
The story could be either really long or really short, and I have to, because he's having a retrospective in November, I know I'll have to talk to press a lot. So this is really good practice for how to.
Okay. Where's the retrospective?
The Brooklyn Museum. It's really a big deal. I mean, it's something I feel like I've waited 30 years for, honestly. But we met, we were a bunch of us, I think in 1972, we're on a subway going out to either Far Rockaway or Coney Island. And there was a group of us, graduates of art school, young artists in New York, just standing on the train. And I remember this small guy in a white Panama hat and a white painted Yashica camera and a little tiny diamond choker. which was interesting because he didn't really play around with gender in the way that he dressed. It was just what he was doing that day. And we figured out, standing in a group of people, that we were both looking for a studio and a place to live. So in that moment, as young people do, we became friends in one moment and decided to live together in the second moment. So another woman on the train knew about a building in Soho that was 5 floors of factories, everything from buttons to lingerie. And she thought the 4th floor might be available. She thought that the 4th floor might be available. She was taking the 3rd floor. And sure enough, this lingerie factory was vacating, and Jimmy and I got this 100-foot long by 20-foot wide space with windows at each end and just put a wall up in the middle. And I love telling this part of the story because a friend of a friend built the wall. I didn't know him, but the person who built the wall turned out to be the person that I'm married to.
Oh,
Talk about coincidences.
Carol Dunham.
Carol Dunham, yes. So, but I never saw him building the wall. They were in and out.
That's a great story.
It's kind of great. And in the wall was a door, and we kept the door pretty much open. And I would go to his place, he would go to my place. And we both set up dark rooms, and he helped me a lot. It was only my second dark room. And we had very similar work schedules. And he only lived there for a few years. He moved out. I have to figure out the dates of when he moved out, but he really taught me so much. And he really was a mentor to me. And I say that he taught me how to be a photographer, and I taught him how to be an artist. And I think that we both brought a very specific set of ideas and a very specific skill set to the table. Because he had studied photography, I had not. I was really well-versed on, or becoming very well-versed on, what the contemporary art scene looked like to a young artist. And he was kind of figuring out how to get out of what then would have been called the photography ghetto, which was a very separate place than being an artist who used a camera.
So photography wasn't taken seriously then as an art form, or it was just beginning to be? Yeah.
It was just beginning. And if you look at it historically, it was all there. I mean, between Warhol and Baldessari, and it was there, but it kind of needed to be named. And of course, the programs in museums, the photography department and the spaces to show photography were always very ghettoized. So my dream was to just hang next to a painting. And I think Jimmy saw the world through the lens of no pun intended, a photographer. So we really brought a lot to the relationship of what our hopes and dreams are. Not that you can name them at the time, but in hindsight, it's easier to see.
Where did this idea come from of creating such sort of specifically staged photographs?
Well, that's such an interesting question. I had friends that were out in the street with their camera, and New York was really dangerous, more dangerous at the time. Not that I was afraid. And I was also a young woman, not that I was at all afraid. I wasn't. But I knew out on the street, I mean, it's hard. It would be hard for someone like you, to imagine the way women were treated on the street then. I mean, I went to school in Italy, and I basically, was like karate chopping men who were pinching my bottom. And New York, I would leave my house down in Soho, and I would just be catcalled by construction workers and truck drivers all the way down the street till I got, it even determined what I wore that day. I knew if I wore a pink beret, they'd all scream, "Hey, pink hat,"
And it's so good to be reminded of that, by the way, because I think you do forget. I mean, that's just something that's not part of my reality at all today.
Thank God. But
thank God.
But we learned how to deal with it. But all of this made me think, I don't want to go out with a camera. Plus, I'm not that person. I just knew I wasn't that person. That capturing reality was never interesting to me. So the setups in my studio gave me, it was almost like, armchair traveling. It was like I was able to create my own world that was much more to my liking. Now, on the other hand, Jimmy was out all night with his camera. He was at clubs, he was at dungeons, he was looking for that kind of work. And the interesting thing was that he had like these three art personalities. The person that took the S&M and bondage pictures, and although they were poetic, these very poetic yet disturbing, sexually provocative pictures. Then there was the Jimmy that photographed the artists, the musical artists of the downtown punk scene, and a lot of which he did to make a living, for journals like the Soho News or the Village Voice. And then there was the Jimmy that made the artwork that he started to make as an artist, a lot of which I modeled for, which was a very lyrical, poetic idea of a body in space, but with this suburban background. Like we would travel together to get those shots. He needed places to shoot. I didn't. But since we were together a lot, I always, I never think of myself as his muse. Maybe more in recent years, I thought of myself as his convenient partner. Like I was willing to go. I was willing to take my clothes off. I was there to learn. I had no self-consciousness. It just seemed very pure at the time, and I barely paid attention. I mean, I realize some of the photos might be a little shocking, but honestly, I see myself in photos and I can barely remember how I felt modeling, or I can't remember having leaves pasted all over my body or having a box over my head. I think I was so much more engaged in what was actually in the photographic aspect of it.
And did he have a sense of humor? I mean, if you compare his work to Mapplethorpe's the obvious comparison with regards to all the bondage and dungeon stuff, but that seems so cold and serious, I think, compared to his work. As a person, was he warm and humorous?
He was extremely shy, and he was very much a gentleman. He didn't like it if he ever, given the way he lived his life, he just didn't like it if he thought I was dating someone who wasn't good enough for me, or if he thought I was in danger. He was very protective, and he was that kind of shy person. If he was your friend and you got on the phone with him, you could not get him off the phone. He was just chatter, chatter, chatter. In fact, it's fascinating because the curator, Drew Sawyer, of the show at the Brooklyn Museum produced a tape for me the other day, which was a conversation between Jimmy DeSana and the dominatrix, Terrence Sellers. So I hadn't heard his voice in 30 years.
Wow.
And it was really amazing to remember this gentle sort of Southern voice. And I also realized that he was a fantastic chameleon. And I realized when I listened to this tape that he took a lot from Warhol. He admired Warhol a great deal, but even the way he talked, the softness of his voice and the kind of restrained manner, I feel like he was very influenced by Warhol in that sense.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting how a voice can evoke memory like that.
Yeah, it was. I can't figure out yet if it was upsetting or not. I know it made me thoughtful, but it was so interesting because as the years go by and I have the estate, of course, the friendship recedes and the artwork is in the foreground.
Yeah.
And, I'm so much about the artwork and protecting it. And, it's part of really big part of my life.
So he died in 1990. And why is the retrospective happening now?
Because it's taken 30 years for people to come around. And that's also a great question, because I think maybe for the first decade I had the work, I never felt like I was doing enough. There was always a sense of inadequacy, ineptitude, like I'm not doing enough. And then I told myself, okay, it's going to take 20 years to archive this and 20 years for people to see the value. But 30 years, it's taken 30 years for people. Like there have been people here and there that have been interested, but I feel like it's going to be a tidal wave of appreciation. I really do.
Thinking about today, Instagram specifically, but all visual social media, the way that everyone now is presenting a version of themselves, a curated version of themselves online, and we might use different versions of trickery and fakery to different degrees, whether it's filters or deep fakes or what have you. What are your thoughts on that with relationship with in relation to what you create? How is it different? What are the similar themes?
Well, I have a kind of sideways answer to that, which is I think if I were the same person, if I was, the essence of who I am, but newly in New York and 22 or 23 years old, maybe having gone to art school, I don't think I would be a visual artist. Because at least from the perspective I have now, because so much of what I was looking for was out in front of me in the future. Like if I had all those, like I think about something as simple as Photoshop and how much time it took me to find the object to fit on the legs, how much shopping it took, how much exploring. I couldn't go to eBay or Etsy, or I had to go to antique stores. I had to go to doll shops. I had to find objects. The search was as much part of the process as the shooting. And now, I could have taken a pair of legs and a picture and boom. So, of course, I'm being a little bit facetious. I would have found a way to be a visual artist, I'm sure, something new, but I feel like the world is serving me up every single thing I ever dreamed about. In terms of like visual, is manifesting. The world is manifesting every visual thing I could have hoped for me to work with now.
Okay, so you're saying that like it's a positive, progressive
well, I'm
thing.
wondering, as I'm saying it, it's both a negative and a positive, because I'm already on my course. I'm, 40 years along on my course. So I've already created my own language and iconography. So I can take all of this stuff and absorb it into my narrative and my story. And my story about gender and my story about role playing started before all this. So I can absorb it and feel okay about it.
Do you want to talk a bit about that journey for you?
Yeah, I think that it started. I feel like there's always been a certain gap between the period of time that I'm making pictures about and the period of time I'm living in. So when I first started to do what I considered my mature work, I was 26. And I was very focused on my upbringing, my post-World War II suburban upbringing, and how proscribed it was, how color coordinated it was, how gender specific it was, how visually rich it was, how spiritually weak it was. Like all of these things that I wanted to talk about in my work. So I was making things about a time in my past. I could really address that, like what it was like to grow up to be raised as a girl and perhaps not fit your parents' or community's idea of how that girl should act. And the same thing with the boy. What TV was like. There's just so much. And if I think about my own path and my own trajectory, fast forward to the future, the surprise from the younger generation is gender fluidity. And that's just providing me with so many new ways to think about it and so many new ways to express this notion of gender. gender specificity and gender stereotypes, which is where I started.
And when, in the 70s, obviously, the height of gay rights movement, and now we're in a kind of trans LGBTQ plus moment. I mean, do you feel like it's all positive and progressive? I've already asked this question in relation to something else, but is there something, do you miss anything from then? Are things better, or are things, in some respects, are there some things that you miss?
No, I don't miss anything from them. And of course, I have a trans son. So I'm very, very, my life is very engaged with the subject of transness. Plus, my son is one of my muses, which kind of shocks me. But every time I turn the camera on him, just something happens. So I think there's nothing sadder than imagining the kind of closeted lives people had. I mean, that really fills me with a tremendous amount of pain to even think about the decade that I was born in, the decade when I was a teenager, and imagining how many people in my own community must have not been living their true lives. And of course, now I get to think about this in terms of trans people and in terms of all the people I meet through my children and the group that I belong to for families of trans people, to think about, I used to focus on the closeted life of a gay person and how painful that must be. And now I think more about the past as a place where people were trapped in many ways. I mean, Americans are under the illusion that there were the good old days. There were no good old days ever. We all know that. We're all too smart to think there were good old days. You may think high school was fun. Maybe those were the good old days.
I saw that I was reading a PJ O'Rourke obituary last week or the week before, and he said something like, I've got one, to people who think about the good old days, I've got one word: dentistry. Which made me laugh.
That's hilarious. Yeah. My father was a dentist too.
Oh. But I mean, going back, even thinking about dolls and your representation of, I'm interested in this, so real people as opposed to fake people, dolls in your images, because so many of us create almost doll-like images of ourselves on the internet today. And
yeah,
at what point does it change from being a real person from a fake person? I mean, your dolls series that you did in the 2010s, I think, where you used Japanese love dolls. And I think there was even a film you made with Meryl Streep when she morphed from a doll into a human. I mean, what was that? What's the dynamic like there? What's the difference for you between directing or setting up with a doll as opposed to directing a real person?
Well, I feel like in the early years of my work, say from 1976 until the early 2000s, like I kept going back and forth between dolls and humans, and I always felt like I failed whenever I tried to shoot a human. Like I felt like I could just never get it right. So I think that the first time I felt like I could shoot a human is when I could put one of those kigurumi masks on their head, so that I had almost like a living, breathing doll who would, cosplay is such a big thing in Japan and all over the world. And the idea that we could, find a persona. It's like when I was a kid, that only happened on Halloween. I could dress up like, I think my sister and I dressed up like Raggedy Ann and Raggedy Andy, these American dolls. I don't know if you had those.
Yeah, and I always thought Raggedy Ann was a girl.
Raggedy Ann is a girl and Raggedy Andy is a boy.
Yeah.
And we dressed up like that. So that was like an opportunity to be a real life doll. But there are people, at least when I was sort of delving into cosplay, people who have their persona and they go out in it all the time. I'm not up to date on the latest, cosplay evolves really quickly, and I'm not up to date on what the latest is. But for me to have a life-size character that was like a doll that I could direct, that didn't fall over every time I walked away, or, I didn't have to find furniture to scale with it, that was really amazing for me. And then I think the first time I ever felt like I could really ace a portrait or capture a portrait is when I started painting the model's eyes, closed eyes, that finally was a way when I felt like wow, this is really working for me. So there's definitely
So that was like a sort of hybrid. Well, it was real people who had eyes. You photographed them with closed eyes, but you had a makeup artist paint eyes on their eyelids. So
right, exactly. And not everybody could figure that out or perceive it, but it gave the portrait what I needed. It gave me what I needed. I mean, and I don't know. I think it will take my whole life for me to figure out why artifice is so much more appealing to me than reality. And that just could be, genetic wiring. I don't know. It's like, there's so much, in a way, art boils down to style in the sense that it's what looks good to you. And I think in the end, you can be the most well-read academic conceptual artist in the world. And in the end, it's your vision that's going to determine what something looks like. Art isn't a solely 100% intellectual activity. It's a mix of a lot of different aspects.
So what do you expect with the upcoming exhibition and your work? What are you expecting? When I said at the beginning of this conversation that I feel like your work and Jimmy's work feels so fresh and like it could have been photographed really recently. What do you think people are taking away from these sort of images now compared to what they would have done when they were taken in the 70s or 80s?
It's so hard for me to know, Danielle. It's always been really hard for me to imagine people standing in front of my work, what they think, what they would say. I mean, the only time I know is if someone comes up to me at an opening and starts talking to me. And then, of course, in that moment, I can't listen anyway. But I've always found it really difficult to imagine the experience of a viewer. I mean, a few times in my life, I've been at a museum or a gallery when I can overhear people talking, and then I always get really nervous. But I don't have an expectation.
I think, I almost feel like our world is we live in a world that's so bizarre in that you can create any visual that you want. But what you're creating is almost like, it feels very authentic because it's so carefully. I mean, anyone can take a photo, right? But not everyone can stage or create what's inside that photo. So that feels, I think people are sort of searching for meaning and authenticity, and maybe that's something that comes across in your work when I look at it.
Well, maybe I think you've just made me have an interesting realization, which is this. In the beginning, when I shot photos and made stage photos, conceptually, it was very important to me that my hands weren't on the work like a painter or a sculptor or a printmaker. It was super important to me. That distance felt very, for lack of a better word, avant-garde and subversive. Now, to hear you say that, I almost feel like there's almost a crafty element to my setups that might draw people to them because they're physical and handmade. I mean, obviously not as I live with a painter. So obviously my hand doesn't touch something. Like he has to touch the canvas. He has to have contact with that thing to make his work. So it's interesting to think that it might have come full circle and maybe appeal to people on a more genuine physical level, even though it's a photograph.
And are you working at the moment on something of your own?
Yeah, I'm working. I have like 5 during the pandemic. I started like 5 or 6 threads of different work, and I feel really sort of lost and blocked. And I talked to a psychic, and the psychic said, "Okay, get it down to 3 threads." So I just made a list and I stopped working on about 3 things. I was really desperate. I was like desperate for information, had to go to a psychic. But yeah, there are things that I'm working on now that I'm starting to get kind of excited about. And a couple of them are very physical and sculptural. They're not photographic.
And are you continuing to explore similar themes around sexual, gender and performance?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's all I mean, one of the things that I'm doing is I have just like years and years and years of very well organized props, color coordinated and all that. And part of me wishes I could throw them in. We have a dumpster parked outside because we're doing a renovation. Part of me wishes I could throw them all away. And then I thought, I'm going to recycle them into my work. So I've been making these things I call deep photos where I just spread everything. It feels like my photos, but instead of photographing these objects, they're physically in the frame. So that's been sort of interesting, though I'm beginning to feel the sadness. They haven't gone anywhere yet. I haven't exhibited them. But now I know what painters and sculptors feel like when they're making a work and it's going to go away. I mean, I can always reprint a photo if I want to see it, but these are going to go away. So that's sort of an interesting thing. But I'm going to go away too. So we're all going to go away.
Okay. That's interesting. Okay. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. I mean, it's super interesting. You've been listening to In Talks with me, Danielle Radoichin. The sound and theme music were by Wargie Productions, and the artwork is by Patrick Waugh. If you enjoyed this episode, please pass it on to someone who you think might also like it. And of course, please do subscribe and leave a review. Thanks for listening.